Picture this. You're traveling somewhere far from home, different language, different customs, everything unfamiliar, and you tap your card at some little shop, and it just works. No questions asked. No haggling over whether your money is real or trustworthy. That instant, almost invisible trust in currency is something we barely think about, right? Money just works, everywhere, all the time. It's one of those background assumptions of modern life we never really question. Honestly, back in school, ancient history always felt like this parade of kings and battles I had to memorize for a test, and then promptly forget. It wasn't until years later, digging into how Athens actually paid for its navy, its temples, its famous democracy, that I realized something that genuinely surprised me. This wasn't just political history. It was basically one of the first real case studies in market economics we have on record. And once you see it, you can't really unsee it. Here's the thing I want to walk you through today, because I think it's honestly one of the most underrated stories. In economic history, Athens didn't just build a city. It built a functioning market economy with trusted currency, regulated trade, primitive banking, even something eerily close to venture capital, over 2,000 years before any of that was supposed to exist, and then it lost almost all of it. Understanding how and why teaches you something surprisingly timeless about what actually makes an economy, or, honestly, your own finances, resilient instead of fragile. So let's get into it. The owl that ruled the ancient world. Let's start with the coin, because it's genuinely one of the coolest financial artifacts in history. Athens sat near a set of silver mines called Laurion, and at one point, they struck a massive new vein of ore. The obvious move, politically, would have been to just hand the windfall out to citizens. Free money, easy popularity. Instead, a statesman named Themistocles convinced the city to pour that silver into building a fleet of warships instead. That decision ended up being the reason Athens could stand up to Persia's navy. A few years later, sometimes the most important financial decision a society makes isn't how to spend a windfall. It's whether to spend it at all. But here's the part that really matters for our story. That same silver got minted into coins stamped with an owl, and those owls, as people called them, became something close to a reserve currency for the entire Mediterranean world. Merchants from Egypt to the Levant trusted Athenian silver because the purity was consistent. No shady dilution, no games. That consistency is basically the whole concept of financial trust in a nutshell. It's not flashy, it's boring reliability. Over and over again, until people stop even questioning it. Why should you care about a 2,000-year-old coin? Because the lesson underneath it is exactly the same one that governs trust. In any currency, any brand, any financial relationship today, consistency compounds into trust, and trust compounds into value. If you want people or markets to believe in you long-term, the boring stuff, done reliably, matters more than any single flashy moment. The rules behind the free market. Here's something people get wrong about Athens' marketplace. The agora. It wasn't some free-for-all where anything goes. Athens depended heavily on imported grain, since its own land wasn't great for growing food at scale, which meant grain security was basically a matter of survival, not just commerce. So the city appointed officials, grain guardians essentially, specifically to prevent hoarding and price gouging on something the whole population needed to eat. I think this trips people up because we tend to imagine the free market and regulation as opposites, like it's one or the other. Athens shows you it's never really that simple. A market only works, long-term, if people trust it isn't rigged against them. Take away that trust, and the whole thing seizes up. Kind of like an engine running without oil. Technically still a machine, just one about to grind itself apart. The takeaway here is worth sitting with, honestly, especially if you've ever felt cynical about markets in general. Rules aren't the enemy of a healthy market. They're often the reason a market survives long enough to become healthy in the first place. Ancient venture capital. The maritime loan. This next one genuinely blew my mind the first time I read about it. Athenian merchants had a way of financing risky sea voyages, called a maritime loan. Basically, a lender would fund a ship's journey to bring back goods like grain from the Black Sea, and if the ship made it back safely, the lender got repaid with hefty interest. But If the ship sank or got seized by pirates, the loan was simply forgiven. No repayment owed. Stop and think about that for a second, because it's essentially venture capital and marine insurance rolled into one. Over 2,000 years before either of those industries had a name, the interest rate wasn't arbitrary. It reflected genuine risk, priced directly into the deal, which is, honestly, exactly how modern investing is supposed to work. Even if we like to pretend we invented the concept recently. Why does this matter to you? Because it's a reminder that risk sharing isn't some modern financial innovation. It's a fundamentally human solution to a fundamentally human problem. How do you attempt something big and uncertain without one person bearing all the danger alone? The takeaway is almost comforting, honestly. Whatever risky, uncertain venture you're weighing right now, humans have been quietly engineering ways to share that risk for millennia. From enslaved worker to banker, the story of Passion. Athens also had informal bankers, called trapeziti, literally table people, because they'd sit at little tables in the agora, handling currency exchange and loans. And one of the most famous of them, a man named Passion, has honestly one of the wildest rags to something like riches stories. In ancient economic history, he started out enslaved, working inside a banking house, gradually earned enough trust handling other people's money that he was eventually freed and went on to become one of the wealthiest, most respected bankers in the entire city, eventually even granted citizenship. I bring this up because it's a genuinely uncomfortable, complicated piece of the puzzle. Athens' economy created real pockets of mobility and opportunity, even for people starting from the bottom of a deeply unequal system. That doesn't erase how brutal and unjust that system was for the vast majority of enslaved people who never got Passion's outcome. But it does show you something true about economies in general. Opportunity tends to show up wherever trust and competence intersect, even inside systems that are, on the whole, badly broken. The takeaway, gently, is this: competence and reliability tend to get noticed and rewarded over time, even in imperfect systems. It's not a guarantee. It's not fair that it should have to be this way, but it's a pattern worth understanding regardless. The empire that quietly paid for democracy. Here's where the story starts bending toward its downfall. After Athens helped defeat Persia, it led a defensive alliance of Greek city-states, called the Delian League, funded by member contributions meant for shared military protection. Over time, Athens moved that shared treasury to its own city, and increasingly used it, not just for defense, but for its own domestic projects, building the Parthenon, funding public works, and famously, paying ordinary citizens to serve on juries and in public office. That jury pay is a genuinely huge deal, by the way. It meant regular working people, not just the wealthy, could actually afford to participate in democracy. It's a beautiful idea. It was also, uncomfortably, funded substantially by money extracted from other city-states. Under the polite language of an alliance, Athens basically built some of its most celebrated civic achievements on top of an economic engine it didn't fully own. Why should this land for you? Because it's a pattern worth recognizing anywhere. An economy, or honestly a household budget, built on an income source you don't actually control, is standing on borrowed ground. It might feel completely stable for decades. It only reveals its fragility the moment that outside source disappears. The fault line finally cracks, and disappear it did. Athens eventually went to war with Sparta in a long, brutal conflict, and partway through, Sparta established a permanent fort inside Athenian territory at a place called Decelia. According to the historian Thucydides, more than 20,000 enslaved workers deserted Athens. As a result, many of them from the Laurion silver mines. Just like that, the engine that had powered Athenian coinage for generations sputtered badly. Athens eventually lost the war outright, lost its fleet, lost its empire, and lost the tribute income that had quietly financed so much of its civic life. A few decades later, a writer named Xenophon actually wrote an entire proposal, essentially an ancient economic recovery plan, arguing Athens needed to rebuild its finances through genuine trade and mining investment, rather than relying on dominating other city-states again. It's a strikingly honest document, almost like watching a society realize, in real time, that its old foundation simply wasn't coming back. The takeaway here is heavy, but important. Systems built on extraction, whether it's from other nations, other people, or frankly, other parts of your own life, you're quietly neglecting, tend to feel invincible, right up until the moment they're not. Real resilience comes from things you actually produce and sustain yourself, not things you're borrowing, one way or another, from someone else's labor or goodwill, bringing it home. So, Athens built something genuinely remarkable, a trusted currency. That circulated across an entire ancient world, regulated markets. That protected ordinary people's access to food, financial tools. That spread risk in ways that wouldn't look out of place in a modern investment pitch. Real, if imperfect, pathways for people to rise through competence and trust. And then it built its most celebrated achievements on a foundation of slavery and extracted tribute. That was never going to hold forever. When the war came and the mines emptied and the empire collapsed, all of that sophistication couldn't save it, because the base underneath had never really been sustainable to begin with. I think about that a lot, honestly. Whenever I look at my own finances, or really any system I depend on, it's easy to mistake sophistication for stability. They're not the same thing. The quiet, boring question worth asking, again and again, is what your own foundation is actually built on. Genuine, sustainable value. You create and control, or something borrowed that just hasn't been called in yet. Athens gives you 2,500 years of hindsight on that question. The least we can do is actually use it.